Blade Runner is an interesting title. An adventure game developed by a company primarily known for strategy titles based off of a movie yet following an original story which utilizes elements from its book source material. That's a combination you don't see all too often. Blade Runner, if you're unfamiliar, is a cinematic spectacle. A film which went on to influence sci-fi, especially with regards to cyberpunk and others which utilized dystopian futuristic cityscapes. It was, and still is, a visual treat, one which just so happens to be based heavily off of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Blade Runner the game, by most rights, shouldn't have worked. A game developed by a company with little experience in the genre based off a detective story which was often as much, if not more, about the visuals and cinematics than the story, released all the way back in 1997. Sounds disastrous. But props to developer Westwood, who treated this as a labor of love. Somehow, despite all technological limitations, they spliced together a game which very much resembles the film it's based on. Not to say it's perfect. Very, very far from it. Just leave it to say there was some real effort put into this one, and it shows, even if those efforts were too often misguided. But let's set the stage. Blade Runner takes place in the year 2019, in the wake of a nuclear war which has devastated the Earth and most indigenous species. Humanity has reached the stars, but the lack of workers and life has led to the creation of artificial life, both in animals and, more notably, replicants. Artificial people engineered to be stronger and smarter than normal people. Unfulfilled with their status in life, some replicants have begun to violently rebel, leading to their complete banning on Earth. To hunt any rogue replicants, police have created a special division dubbed Blade Runners. You play as Ray McCoy, a young detective brought in on a probationary status to the unit due to a sudden overload of cases. It's a solid basis for a story, one which compares and contrasts easily with that of the film, most especially in the characters. In particular, McCoy stands in stark contrast with Deckard, a younger and somewhat more ambitious and naive take on the in-over-his-head detective, one who allows the player to easily explore the dystopian future representation of Los Angeles. His opposite is Clovis, who fills the role of replicant leader and warrior poet which Roy took in the film. Clovis is more poet than warrior compared to Roy, but don't take that to mean he's a gentler character. Whereas Roy is passionate and often animalistic, eventually finding his humanity, Clovis is far colder and arguably even more violent, and never does wind up making that leap. While part of this may be due to a lack of understanding by the writers and just how to humanize this character, Clovis also doesn't do much to represent the sympathetic side of the replicants. Unfortunately, the characters who are supposed to offer those sympathetic sides are rather weak themselves. Lucy is in many ways the face of the replicants in the game, an innocent wholly incapable of the violence of her companions. She is bright and optimistic and incredibly creepy. See, Lucy has the body of a 14-year-old and the mind of a 5-year-old. She dresses like a punk teenager in a mini-skirt and jacket which leaves very little to the imagination, yet is disgusted by the idea of anything remotely sexual, plays with knit dolls, and speaks like Lenny of Mice and Men, of the birds and the flowers and the bright sunny lake she wants to visit at the end of the rainbow. More, should you go down a sympathetic route, she becomes very obsessive with McCoy, to a very creepy degree considering her childish mentality, leaving her not nearly so sympathetic as was obviously intended. Her polar opposite is Crystal, a fellow Blade Runner who plays more like the love interest in a cheap action film than a cyberpunk noir character. Crystal hates replicants and talks about little more than killing them and wanting to kill them. And when she's not talking about it, she's doing it. Crystal is your most obvious representative within the Blade Runners, and she's both wholly unlikable and sticks out like a sore thumb, as if she belongs within an entirely different genre. Funnily enough, it's the characters and situations writers didn't mean to be so sympathetic which put forth the best arguments. Gordo and Dectora are both secondary characters who feature nearly exclusively in a third of 5 acts. Both their stories are subtle, and speak of characters neither inherently violent nor completely innocent, who have been forced into your crosshairs and may elect to defend themselves as a result. Their stories are tragic yet subdued, a strong footnote to a grander tale to influence the eventual choices you're forced to make. Their only downside is just how infrequently they feature. While Gordo pops in and out of the game and can be seen from the beginning to hint at his potential connections to the greater picture, it's unlikely to see Dectora at all until the 3rd act, and a sympathetic route can speed her development from 0 to 100 within a space of seemingly minutes. To contrast that sympathy with the replicants isn't specific sympathy with any one character, but the horrifying actions of Clovis and some of his violent allies. It isn't difficult to imagine why replicants need to be hunted, why they're banned from Earth, why there's so many restrictions placed on them when they so easily murder and maim others. All this stands strong within the story, but it's unfortunate much of it doesn't stand strong within the climax. While the game tries to replicate the tears in the rain ending of the film in one way or another, the attempts fall flat at best. That's really how the game rolls. Great moments are often interspersed with ones which fall completely flat to make for a jumble which can be difficult to judge as a whole. Each act comes with great positives and negatives. At its best, the game gives us a beautiful detective story with plenty of mystery and questions. Then all of a sudden, one of the major issues appears to try and unravel all those positives, each act containing a whole new host of issues. The first act is the most consistent. Your introduction to the world is all of beautiful, grimy, cold, and intriguing. McCoy is set to investigate a massacre of animals at a pet store, and the act has nearly everything you could ask for. There's plenty of investigation, early clues to a deeper story, traversing a dark cityscape into the depths of the poor, unfortunate, and deprived, solid characterization, use of the Esper unit seen in the film to enhance and investigate photographs in ways which don't seem entirely within the realm of possibility, and a climactic finish which hints toward a grander tale. It's everything you could ask for to begin the game, minus the use of the Voight-Kampff test, a sort of advanced emotional response test designed to determine if an individual is a replicant. I'll also mention that the act introduces a concept which wasn't really present in the film, but more of a plot aspect in the book, that of emotional attachments to animals. You'll see this throughout the game, that characters often seem to value animals far more than their fellow man, and it's an obscure aspect to introduce unless you've read the book, one that can be more than a little off-putting at points. Anyway, Act 2 picks up right where the first left off, setting a new case on your table seemingly unrelated to the first. It escalates the need for investigation well, providing a case which isn't so easy to solve, but quickly deteriorates under the weight of two of the game's major problems: reliance on nostalgia and randomization. I'll get into both more later, but leave it to say that what should have been one of the highlight chapters of the game with its emphasis on investigation and follow-through quickly bogs down from a myriad of problems, beginning with an over-reliance on randomization, continuing with a long string of nostalgic references to the film which don't go anywhere, and ending with the only major story sequence of the game to not feature any sort of choice, and a weak one at that, as the developers seemingly couldn't figure out a way for McCoy to interact with some of his antagonists without a short, ridiculous capture scenario which doesn't last longer than a cutscene. Act 3 is where the shortness of this sequence plays out, but doesn't take too much time getting back on track, and after one more quick cameo, it's off to the strength of the game again, that of investigating leads and tracking down replicants. There's some more issues with randomization I'll point out later, but this chapter is really the highlight to the game. You find clues, follow up on them, interview people about them, and confront 3 different characters who may or may not be replicants. These confrontations are great, but depending on how and when they happen, they can end with the character simply running off without any ability to stop them, potentially never to be seen again. It's a likely anticlimax for at least one of the characters, and though it can be stopped in the case of Gordo and Lucy, it's so difficult to do so I believe my recording is the only one online which shows it being done. Still, the act is fun and engaging, with a lot of detective work finally paying off, broken only by a ridiculous sequence near the end which sets you up for the fourth act. It's stupid, cheesy, and interrupts a far better flow. It's basically Crystal in a nutshell. But then you make your final decision with a replicant, which sets you on the path of Sympathizer or Blade Runner, and it's off to Act 4 with you. And I'm not going to mince words. Act 4 is awful. On paper, it's not a bad idea. You're hunted by the police, so now you get to experience what it's like to live in fear. Only this just amounts to you running around a sewer maze with cops who may randomly show up in different sections to try and shoot you down. That's it. Other than that, you're offered 4 entire interactions throughout the entire chapter. 1 which may not happen depending on prior choices, and 2 which amount to in-game cutscenes as you don't actually have any choices or options. All of this for the sake of a police corruption plot which, while actually fairly well done, really does not belong in the title. This chapter does quite a bit to interrupt the flow of a more engaging story. At a point where you should be learning about the replicants you've been chasing, developing them into more sympathetic characters, and truly making McCoy question himself, we're instead sidetracked by this bad cop story which is tangential at best to what's actually going on. It's equal parts boring and frustrating, if not especially long, if you know how to navigate the sewers at least. Act 5 picks things back up, though in many ways the damage has been done. By now you've been pretty well locked into either a Sympathizer or Blade Runner route for one of 3 basic endings, which in turn branch out further. Either you run away with a love interest, that being Lucy or Dectora, meet with Clovis and escape on a moon bus at the outskirts of town, or confront the remaining replicants at the moon bus. There are little additions here and there based on previous choices, like if you found all the DNA data, which would allow the replicants to expand their lifespan, but that's the basic gist of it. Taken at face value, the endings are each decently satisfying for the end of their parts, but there's one funny little quirk. See, you're not actually locked into a path by this point. At any point, you can still turn on your supposed ally and get the other end, only the game doesn't respond well to it. Most of the end will still play out like you're still on the same path, only the ending cutscene will showcase what you actually did. In other words, the game accounts for your actions, but only at the last second, which is more than a little off-putting. So yeah, that's Blade Runner. It's a visual treat that does a lot right for a futuristic detective story, but it had numerous major failings, mostly tied to the lofty ambitions of the developers. Those failings can be tied down to character, story focus, and randomization. Characters is simple. Those characters who should have been the most sympathetic to the player, Lucy and Crystal, are not at all due to being so heavily exaggerated. Instead, the replicants who are left most sympathetic, Dectora and Gordo, have much of their stories told through subtle clues and lack screen presence, while sympathy for the Blade Runners comes mostly through the extreme violence of Clovis and his right-hand man, Sadiq, neither of whom are remotely sympathetic, despite attempts to make Clovis imitate Roy from the film. Story focus is split into 2 parts. First is nostalgia. While it's nice seeing references here and there, the game bogs down far too much with them. When you should be getting more clues in a second act, for instance, you're thrown into this long cutscene in Tyrell's office with Rachel and Tyrell, which doesn't actually add anything whatsoever to the story. You get no clues, no reveal, nothing. It's a pure cameo which doesn't even discuss the crime which happened within his building, or the long chase through the Bradbury building, which was seemingly built just to trace the steps of Deckard in the film, but had a whole lot of nothing going on. Second is the side stories, or really, story. Let's just put this out there. Guza is a decent character, predictable, but his story is told well. He was completely superfluous and his story belonged nowhere in the game. It interrupts pacing when the story is building toward its climax. Developers should have brought back Bryant and focused the story better upon the hunt for replicants. And if they wanted a McCoy is the hunted chapter, well, that could have been done in far better ways than what we experienced here. Finally is the randomization. The Developers had this idea to make each playthrough different by giving us two types of randomization. The first is characters. At the start of each game, the story decides which characters are replicants and who your third act final confrontation will be, and throws around a few clues towards this. It's a great idea on paper, but just doesn't work at all. For starters, it doesn't tend to matter which characters are replicants, because if they're not replicants, then they're sympathizers and the story plays out the same, just with a small tweak in dialogue or during their confrontation. Second, most of the time it doesn't make much sense. Like, Sadiq can be human. This wiry guy who picks up 400-pound men and tosses them like a rag doll can be human. Sure. Or Lucy, this girl who is in the care of Clovis, who landed on Earth within the last few weeks, and calls him father. She can be human. Even McCoy can be one of the replicants who escaped to Earth weeks ago, even though he's a detective with enough of a record to be recommended as one of the handfuls of Blade Runners. This idea was not thought out very well, and doesn't offer much payoff. Worse, since it's all randomized, you're almost assuredly going to find some character which doesn't make any sense because of this. Then there's the soft randomization. This is something which can be changed moment to moment. Sometimes certain characters or items will show up, sometimes they won't. For the most part, this isn't a problem. Every once in a while, though, it's at its absolute worst in Act 2. You're set to confront a character named Izo, and you must do this to proceed any further. Problem 1. Izo does not always stand where he's supposed to. He randomly enters and exits his shop. A new player will not know where this shop, which you cannot enter until after you confront him, is in the long line of shops on Animoid Row, and have no idea what he looks like, nor will he know the character is gating them from proceeding. So this character, who may or may not be present at any one moment, is keeping the player from progressing without their knowing. Problem 2. Izo gives the player 2 minutes to speak. Only the game doesn't measure time correctly, so it's impossible to go through his entire dialogue without him ending the conversation prematurely and entering his shop, where you cannot follow. He literally just up and walks away without a further word. Only, you still need to actually confront Izo to trigger the next stage of the game. The player has no way of knowing they must wait for Izo to come back out and carry on with the conversation as if he hadn't just walked out midway through. Problem 3. You may not be able to trigger the confrontation. There are 2 ways to trigger the confrontation with Izo. The first is to collect Crystal's interviews with a suspect in custody and interview said suspect yourself. Only, the game can randomly decide to put off giving you the interviews when you go to collect them, making interviewing the suspect and thus confronting Izo about the suspect impossible. Fortunately, there is another way. By speaking with another weapon seller, you can find out Izo is a little shady and confront him about it. Sometimes, however, this dialogue option does not appear correctly, and if you already spoke to him and chose a similar option, then that confrontation path is locked off to you. Meaning, you can explore and do everything right and be unable to continue because the game is blocking off clues for 0 reason. Problem 4. When you confront Izo, he runs away. Now most of the time this ends simply. Crystal gets him and it's whatever. If you go back to your spinner, he kills you. Game over, that's it. If you try to shoot him, well, that's where it gets complicated. Izo is one of those characters who may or may not be a replicant. Unlike every other character, however, there are no clues which indicate what he might be. So if you try to shoot him, you're taking another game over risk. Hate this character yet? Hold on, because there is. Problem 5. Izo is completely superfluous. After confronting him, McCoy decides he's reached a dead end, and decides to go wandering some other location for leads, opening up said location. That's right. Izo doesn't offer anything to the central story. He is actually only a part of the Guza corruption story, and yet gates you off from the story with randomized bullshit. Motherfucker. Last issues I'll mention are these. The game doesn't recognize timing correctly due to the speed of modern machines, but mostly this just plays out in the shooting range, a completely optional bit where I quite literally took over an hour of footage and cut it down to around 11 minutes. It also affects the activity of crowds in one of the time-based puzzles, but this is a mostly negligible gripe. What isn't quite so negligible is the utter disappointment of the Voight-Kampff test. This is one of those iconic items from the film which they really needed to not screw up. Yet, here we are. The basic gist is this. You ask questions designed to spark an emotional response to determine if someone is human or a replicant. It's an interesting concept which can tell you a lot about a character beyond whether they're human or not. Unfortunately, the questions the developers came up with just weren't that interesting, and you can actually tell which were taken from the film because they're far more engaging. As well, McCoy reads the questions off in the most boring monotone for no reason. Worse than all this, though, is how the developers tried to make a game of it, but just gave up halfway through. See, they decided to set strange limitations to the test in a poor attempt at difficulty, but failed to finish. For example, you were only allowed to ask 10 questions before getting an inconclusive result, despite one of the major points in the film being one character asking another well over 100. They then offer you 3 levels of emotional questions, with higher level questions which are supposed to get a more emotional response, yet pushing the subject closer to the breaking point, quitting the test early. That's not how it works, however. Subjects respond to different questions completely differently, independent of their emotional level, so it's not uncommon for low-level questions to offer a high-level response. There's also no actual breaking point. Your subjects will not grow more emotional or break under strain. What actually happens is there's one high-level question which will break them down and get them to quit immediately. It could be the first one you ask, or it could never be asked at all. There's no way to choose or avoid it other than to never ask high-level questions. And if you do fail, that's it, no retries. Either continue on or reload. Incredibly disappointing. So yes, the game could have been better. A bit of focus and a few constraints during development, and this could have easily been one of the great classics of the point-and-click adventure genre. To many, it still is. The game is often beautiful, even despite its age, with a soundtrack which does well to complement its ambience, even if it doesn't stand out particularly, and the story is surprisingly layered with subtle touches, despite how obvious and exaggerated so many of the central characters and storylines are. So how to recommend Blade Runner the video game? Obviously, if you're a fan of the series, this is a must-own title. It offers a fantastic delve into a familiar world with its own storyline. Fans of point-and-click adventures will find a lot to love here as well. The story is overall solid for its genre, and offers a good few unique features you won't find much elsewhere. And though some bits might bog down in execution, it's a little fans of the genre should be used to already. If you're not a fan of either, then there won't be much of interest to find here. But if you're interested in giving the genre a chance, there's just enough ease of use to give it a try, if you can find a copy.